Hi, Porter. It's Mrs. Curry again. Today I'm going to be reading you chapters 5 and 6 of BFG. So if you've missed out on our Zoom call today, make sure you're checking in here on our YouTube video. Before we start today, our quick write for the day is: have you ever tried to communicate with someone that spoke a different language? Tell about it below. So I want you to think about it. What's it like when you try to talk to somebody who may not speak English or your native language? How do you feel? Is it frustrating? Is it exciting? How does it feel to talk to somebody that may not speak the same language as you? So for me, I've been to a couple other countries and I've talked to people who don't speak English like I do. And it is kind of frustrating sometimes, but sometimes you have to be creative. So I can talk with my hands, I can show different pictures, I can do all sorts of visual things to try to help me learn. So while I think it might be frustrating and maybe sometimes a little annoying, it also is kind of helpful and I can be able to use my creativity side. Awesome. So today we have 3 vocabulary words for our chapters today. And our chapters are kind of long today, so make sure you're sticking with me today. Our first word is cross. So can you say cross? And it's not cross like a crosswalk or cross like this, like a sign. It means annoyed. It's an adjective, and we use it as the word annoyed. Our next word is colossal. Can you say colossal? Colossal means gigantic or huge, like this woolly mammoth right here, colossal. And our last word is hullabaloo. This is one of my favorite words, hullabaloo. So a hullabaloo is a loud noise with lots of noise or a very large disturbance. So today what you're going to do is you're going to write in the back of your notebook your 3 vocabulary words today. So make sure that you pause the video so that you can write down your vocabulary words for the day. Awesome. Okay, so now we are going to read today. And your job, if you're in my class, is to make sure that you upload pages 7 and 8 of your student packet. Okay, you're going to be responsible for completing this on your own after we read our story. Throughout the story today, you're going to hear some kind of funky language and things that might not sound right to you. Okay, and so you guys are going to have to become detectives and figure out what someone's saying. Right? So just like we just talked about with people speaking a different language, somebody in our book may speak something different and it may not sound quite right to you. So you have to be a detective to figure out what they're saying. You're going to use pages 9 and 10 today as we read to work on that. That's called the mystery words. And I'm going to stop as I read and think about those things. Okay, so we are continuing our reading today. We are on chapter 5. It's called the BFG. So last time we read, he brought Sophie to his cave. He put her on this table that was a gigantic table. They had full walls of jars of all sorts of stuff. So that's where we are. We're left in this dark cave with all these jars and this big table and Sophie being in there. The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing him massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibal-y and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant is for supper. Bone-crunching giant chomps up and chews and crunches up 2 wopsy, whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones going crackety-crack for miles around. "Ouch!" Sophie said. Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey, the giant said. Every night, Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble up the Turks. Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark, and she was becoming quite angry. Why Turks? She blurted out. What's wrong with the English? Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beans has a glamourly flavor, and he says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey. Oh, well, I suppose he's right, Sophie said. Of course he would be, said the giant. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddlyumptious and some is yuck slush. Greeks is all full of yuck slush. No giant is ever eaten Greeks ever. Why not? Sophie said. Greeks from Greece is tasting all greasy, said the giant. I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this was talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working an appetite by talking about food. As I am saying, the giant went on, all human beings is having some different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats. Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his giant ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your heads is emptier than Bungle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the giant into a different conversation toward a less dangerous type of food. Here she is on the table talking to the giant. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said. We is having an interesting dabblement about the taste of human being, and the human being is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human being, the giant said. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. What's that word mean? Annoyed. Good job. The human being, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting all whooshy of fish. This is something very fishy about Wales. You mean whales? Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, said the giant. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys? Sophie said. You are once again gobble-funking, the giant shouted. Don't you do it! This is serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they're tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste like? Sophie asked. Danes, the giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes. Are you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington, Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste, says so welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, said the giant. Oh, of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over with and done with right away than being kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others? Yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a giant, nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. And I is the big friendly giant. I is BFG. What's your name? My name is Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news that she had just heard. So that's the end of chapter 5, BFG. We still haven't gotten to any of our mystery words yet, so we're gonna keep listening. Chapter 6, The Giants. But if you are so nice and friendly, Sophie said, then why do you snatch me from my bed and run away with me? Because you saw me, said the big friendly giant. If anyone was ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away, hip switch. Ooh, okay, so that's one of our words. I'm going to pause for a second. If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away, hip switch. It's kind of a funky word, but remember, we're being detectives. So what is the BFG talking about right here? He's saying if anybody were to ever see a giant, they must be taken away. What can we say? What do you think? Quickly, right? Awesome. So if they're saying if a boy or girl sees a giant, they have to be taken away quickly. So what you're going to write is on that page where it says hip switch. We know that word hip switch means quickly. So we're going to write that down right here. Why? Asked Sophie. Well, first of all, the BFG said, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist. I do, Sophie said. But that is only one because you have seen me, cried the BFG. I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you actually seen a giant. So let's stop for a second. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. So our word there is scuttling. What does scuttling mean? Let's try to think about this. The first thing you would be doing, so if I saw a giant, the first thing I would do is run and tell someone. So if I'm running and telling someone, that's what scuttling means. You would be running around, yodeling the news, or telling the news that you actually seen the giant. So scuttling means running. So I'm going to put that word right next to scuttling. So you can see what I'm doing with my page right here. So as I hear those words in the story, I'm thinking about what does that word mean? I'm using the context clues. I'm thinking about my own life and what exactly would that be meaning for me. So I'm not going to continue going through this just because of time, but you should be able to, as I'm reading, listen to that. And you'll see the sentences on the page here to continue to think about what those funky words might mean. You need to be a word detective too and finish this sheet. So back to our story. The first thing you would be doing, you'd be scuttling around, yodeling the news that you actually seen a giant, and then a great giant hunt and a mighty giant look-see would be starting up all over the world, with human beings all rummaging around the great giant you saw and getting wildly excited. People would be coming rushing and brushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and locking me into a cage to be stared at. They would be putting me into a zoo or the bunkum house with all those squiggly hippo dumplings and crocodiles. Sophie knew what the giant said was true. If any person actually ever reported seeing a giant haunting the streets of a town at night, there would most certainly be a terrific hullabaloo across the world. I would bet you, the BFG went on, that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you? If I hadn't wiggled you away. I suppose I would, Sophie said. And that would never do, said the BFG. So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked. If you go back, you will be telling the world, said the BFG, most likely on the telly bunkum box and that radio squeaker thing you have. You'll just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life. Oh no, cried Sophie. Oh yes, said the BFG, but I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming an unky monkey end. Ucky mucky end. I is showing you now who is going to eat you up if they is ever catching even one tiny little glimpse of you. The big friendly giant picked Sophie up off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled a huge stone to one side and said, "Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you was seeing." Sophie, sitting on the BFG's hand, peeped out of the cave. The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland with the blue rockets and dead trees. "Is you seeing them?" the BFG asked. Sophie squinted through the glare of the sun, saw several tremendous tall figures moving amongst the rocks. Three or four others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. "This is giant country," the BFG said. "Those is all giants, every one of them." It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant whose hand she was now sitting on. And oh, how ugly they were! Many of them had these large bellies. All of them had long arms and big feet. They were too far away for their faces to be seen clearly. Perhaps that was a good thing. "What on earth are they doing?" Sophie asked. "Nothing," said the BFG. "They is just moochling and foochling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will be galloping off to places where people is living and to find their suppers." "You mean to Turkey?" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant will be galloping to Turkey, of course," said the BFG. "But the others will be whiffling off to all sorts of fungal places like Wellington for booty flavor and Panama for the hatty taste. Every giant is having their own favorite hunting ground." "Do they ever go to England?" Sophie asked. "Often," said BFG. "They say English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crod scallop." "I'm not quite sure what that means," Sophie said. "Meanings is not important," said the BFG. "I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right." "And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people?" Sophie asked. "All of them is guzzling human beings every night," the BFG answered. "All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky mucky end if any of them should ever be getting their gogglers upon you. You would be swallowed up like a piece of frumpkin pie, all in one dollop." "But eating people is horrible," Sophie cried. "It's frightful. Why doesn't somebody stop them?" "And who, please, is going to be stopping them?" asked the BFG. "Couldn't you?" said Sophie. "Never in a pig's whistle!" cried the BFG. "All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness." "Twice as high as you?" cried Sophie. "Easily that," said the BFG. "You is seeing them up in the distance, but just wait till you get to them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall with huge muscles, and cockles alive-o. I is the titchy one. I is the runt. 24 feet is pundle nuts in giant country." "You mustn't be feeling bad about it," Sophie said. "I think that you are just great. Why, even your toes must be as big as sausages." "Bigger," said the BFG, looking pleased. "They is as big as bubble hammers." "How many giants are out there?" Sophie asked. 9 altogether," answered the BFG. "That means," said Sophie, "that somewhere in the world every night 9 wretched people get carried away and eaten alive." "More," said the BFG. "It's all depending, you see, on how big the human beings is. Japanese beans is very small, so a giant will need to gobble up about 6 Japanese before is feeling full. Others, like the Norway people and the Yankee Doodles, is ever so much bigger, and usually 2 or 3 of those makes a good tuck-in." "But do these disgusting giants go to every single country in the world?" "All countries except for Greece is getting visited some time or another," the BFG answered. "The country which had which a giant visits is dependent on how he's feeling. If it is a very warm weather and the giant is feeling as hot as a sizzle pan, he will probably go galloping far up to the frisbee north to help himself to an Eskimo or two to cool him down. A nice fat Eskimo to a giant is like a lovely ice cream lolly to you. I'll take your word for it, Sophie said. And then again, if it's a frosty night and the giant is fridging with cold, he'll probably point out to his nose toward the sweltering hotlands to guzzle a few Hottentots to warm himself up. How perfectly horrible, Sophie said. Nothing hots a giant up like a hot Hottentot, BFG said. And if you were to put me down on the ground and I was to walk out among them, Sophie said, would they really eat me up? Like a whiffswittle, cried the BFG. And what is more, you were so small they wouldn't even have to chew you. Like the first one to be seeing you would pick you up in his fingers and down you like a drop of drain water. Let's go back inside, Sophie said. I hate even watching them. And that's the end of chapter 6. So be sure to tune in next time to hear the next couple chapters. And make sure you're uploading pages 7, 8, 9, and 10 to your Seesaw so that I can see your work. Bye, guys.